All right, babies, we're back. Woohoo! Let's do this. In the last chapter, we basically discussed how to analyze current states and what a lot of things came into it. Maybe we can do a quick brief. Nah, fuck it. All right. So this chapter is defining a future state. What we're going to do is the same basically pattern. We're going to define its purpose and description, and then after that, basically, what are the inputs that come to it? Amazing. Oof, fuck ton of inputs, yeah? Like strategizing requires a fuck ton of information. And then what are the elements that go with it? And after that, basically, we have to consider if these are the elements. Guidelines and tools, techniques, and the stakeholders, eventually the outputs. So let's do this. Seems doable. Let's see how much time we go for. What can we do? That's a lot. All right, define future state. What's the purpose? The purpose of define future state is to determine the set of necessary conditions to meet the business need. So when we are analyzing the current state, from there we're kind of like launching to whatever we want. So defining a future state is important, and it basically like determines what are the conditions that would actually allow the future to exist the way we want it. The description: all purposeful change must include a definition of success. What is our goal? Business analysis work is to ensure that the future state of the enterprise is well defined, that is achievable within the resources available, and that key stakeholders have a shared consensus vision of the outcome. I really want you to think of this as manifestation, because ultimately, like, what are we doing? We're manifesting the outcome, and we're basically setting everything in a way where the outcome is exactly how we want. As with current state analysis, the purpose of future state analysis is not to create a comprehensive description of the outcome at a level of detail that will directly support implementation. It's not, because like details change and everything is moving. Like we need to have a certain movement that's probably versatile or something on the terms of like fluid, because like you never know where what you might hit and what might change. The future state will be defined at the level of detail that allows for competing strategies to achieve the future state to be identified and assessed. Ultimately, like clarifying the points that allow us to actually like clarifying the strategies that will take us to that to those points. Those the details of how implementation comes is probably while we're actually moving. Provides a clear definition of the outcomes that will satisfy the business needs. Details of the scope of details the scope of the solution space, like how far are we willing to actually look in order for us to get it, and allows for value associated with the future state to be assessed, and enables consensus to be achieved among key stakeholders. Like, okay, so like stakeholders had to kind of butt in on this one as well. The future state description can include any context about the proposed future state. It describes the new, removed, and modified components of the enterprise. It can include like all the things that might have changed with the enterprise, kind of like are identified, are described. Changes to the boundaries of the organization itself, such as entering a new market, performing a merger or acquisition, all that good stuff. The future state can also be simple changes to existing components of the organization. We discussed components at large last time. Spent like 10 minutes on them now, such as changing a step in process or removing a feature from an existing application. Change may be needed to any component of the enterprise, including but not limited to the business processes, functions, lines of business, organizational structures, staff competencies, knowledge and skills, training, facilities, desktop tools, organization locations, data information, application systems, and or technology infrastructure. It's super cool. Now, sorry, I'm feeding the cat. Okay. The descriptions may include visual models and text to clearly show the scope, boundaries, and details relevant. Details. Relevant relationships between entities are identified and described. The efforts required to describe the future state varies depending on the nature of the change. Exactly, like we have to keep in mind things might change. All right. Sorry, I'm feeding the cats. So the expected outcomes of the change might include specific metrics or loosely defined results. Describing the future state allows stakeholders to understand the potential value that can be realized from the solution, which can be used as part of decision-making processes regarding the change strategy. I'm going to read this again. Describing the future state allows stakeholders to understand the potential value that can be realized from a solution. Okay. Which can be used as part of the decision-making process, of course. Okay. So ultimately, when it comes to stakeholders, we have to be able to kind of like describe it and explain it to stakeholders, and they have to say yes and understand what we're talking about. In environments where change results is predictable and predictable outcomes and predictable delivery of value, and where there are a large number of possible changes that can increase value, the purpose of future state analysis is to gather sufficient information to make the best possible choices among potential options and to, okay, potential options, that was adults. So we keep in mind things could change and everything that you could actually like interact with at the very least would actually make some form of difference. So you have to look at your environment in a way that allows you to kind of like explore it unbiased, I guess. In cases where it is difficult to predict the value realized by a change, the future state may be defined by identification of appropriate performance measures to produce the agreed upon set of measures for business value. And this change strategy will support exploration of multiple options. So ultimately, if you can't envision what the future could look like, then ultimately you kind of go like, no, we don't know how this would look like, but we know that if we get this much, for example, like key performance measures or basically KPIs, if we produce this much, we'll be able to cut costs. If we do this, we'll be able to like sell more. If we do this, we'll be able to organize ourselves differently. What are the inputs and business requirements, the problems, opportunities, or constraints that the future state will address? These are the business requirements. Inputs, business requirements, and then in the future state, we have guidelines and tools, which are constraints, current state description, metrics and key performance indicators, organizational strategy. And then the outputs go into like business objective, future state description, and potential value. So here, in the business objective, we're getting tasks using this output are going to be basically when we're preparing for elicitation, manage stakeholder collaboration, assessing risk, validating requirements, analyze potential value, and recommend solution, measure solution performance, assess enterprise, recommend actions to increase solution value. So it's things that we did in chapter 4, basically, when we're eliciting, and things that we potentially do in the future. When we're using future state description, we're also using the manage stakeholder collaboration. We're outputting to how to manage stakeholder collaboration, assess risk, define change strategy, validate requirements, define design options, analyze potential, blah, blah, blah. Tasks using this output, which is potential value, are preparing for elicitation, assessing risks, validating requirements. Okay, so like this part of our basically exercise is used in multiple places. Let's dive a bit deeper on the elements. Business goals and objectives. These are the elements, right? No. Business goals and objectives. A future state can be described in terms of business objectives or goals in order to guide the development of the change strategy and identify potential value. Okay? What are the objectives? What are the goals? Business goals and objectives describe the ends and the organization is seeking to achieve. Goals and objectives can relate to changes that the organization wants to accomplish or current conditions that it wants to maintain. Goals are long-term, ongoing, and qualitative statements of the state or condition that the organization is seeking to establish and maintain. Examples of business goals include create a new. I love how they found ways to explain things in just boring detail, right? Because ultimately, this whole thing right now, this whole thing is literally just kind of like elaborating in 3 different ways on goals and objectives and whatever. So how can we explain goals and objectives? What do goals and objectives actually like? How do they affect the business? Create a new capability such as a new product service, addresses a competitive disadvantage and create a new competitive advantage, improve revenue by increasing sales or reducing costs, increase customer satisfaction, increase employee satisfaction, comply with new regulations, improve safety, reduce time to deliver product or service. So these are examples of goals and business goals. High-level goals can be decomposed to break down the general strategy into areas that may lead to desired results. By high level, I think they're talking about goals that actually affect the entire organization instead of like different departments in it. For example, increased customer satisfaction is an example, and operational excellence or business growth. For example, a goal may be increase number of high revenue customers, and the further refined into the goal to increase number of high revenue customers in the 30-45 age bracket by like 30% within 6 months. So that's them going into detail, like what is it that we're trying to do. How they chose 30 to 45 age bracket, I have no idea. Where the number 30% come from, maybe it's based on like how they've been growing so far and they want to push it or something like this. As goals are analyzed, they are converted into more descriptive, granular, and specific objectives and linked to measures that make it possible to objectively assess if objective has been achieved. Okay, so basically we connect them with like points, like objective points where we kind of like reach this, and from there we actually have to decide how to achieve them or what it actually like entails. Kind of like what we're doing now, like inputs and outputs and the elements of it and all the good stuff. Defining measurable objectives is often critical to justify completing the change and might be a key component to a business case for a change. A common test for assessing objectives is to ensure they are smart. I love this because I actually read it once when we were trying to do like non-functional analysis. Like describe something that has an observable outcome. It's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bounded. Measurable means you tracking and measuring the outcome. You can do that. Achievable means testing the feasibility of the effort. Relevant means aligning the enterprise's vision, mission, and goals. And time-bounded, defining a time frame that's consistent with the need. So basically here we're seeing if it's specific, if you can measure it, if it can be achieved, if it's relevant, and if it kind of like, if you can place the time on it. Another element is the scope of solution space. Decisions must be made about the range of solutions that will be considered to meet the business goals and objectives. The scope of the solution space defines which kinds of options will be considered when investigating possible solutions, including changes to the organizational structure, capabilities and processes, technology and infrastructure, policies, products or services, or even creating a changing relationships within organizations currently outside the scope of the extended enterprise. So ultimately, like we have to kind of like narrow it down to what are the things that could be relevant or what are the things that we're willing to do. Solutions in each of these areas require specific expertise from both the business analysis and the delivery team. The analysis of this might happen on different levels in the enterprise, and the scope of the solution space is not necessarily related to the size of the change. Even a small change might require looking at the enterprise level business objectives to ensure alignment. So the idea behind this is like, so we're iterating, right? Like we're looking at what the solution is, where the business is, and how they kind of like combine with each other and how far it is. And we need to make sure like the things that we're actually looking at are necessary for how we were trying to like get things done, or else we kind of like might overwhelm ourselves, or it could be underwhelming, which means it's not really like fulfilling its purpose. If multiple future states can meet the business needs, goals, and objectives, it will be necessary to determine which ones will be considered. This decision is typically based on the value to be delivered to stakeholders and requires an understanding of possible change strategies. So we have to understand basically like what is the value of every single solution that we're having and how does it contribute to the scope and how can we use it in different places, and ultimately that's what we kind of like change strategies is about. It's kind of like finding strategies that actually work. And the critical considerations for the decision are dependent on the overall objectives of the enterprise, but will involve an understanding of the quantitative and qualitative value of each portion. So here, what we're considering is basically how the enterprise is moving, where it wants to move, and understanding the quantitative stuff, which is basically probably KPIs and the money aspects of things, and the qualitative value of each option. So qualitative, again, like morale, better logistical approach, all that kind of stuff. The time needed to achieve each future state, because time as well is a constraint that we always have to consider, because ultimately if you want to do something and you take a year instead of 6 months, maybe at the 6 month mark, you kind of like are still in the market, and after a year you're no longer valid because the market changes quickly. Who the fuck knows? And the opportunity cost to the enterprise. Like opportunity cost is literally like, what are we missing if we dive into this? So that could probably be qualitative and quantitative at the same time. I don't know. Constraints. Constraints describe aspects of the current state, respects of the planned future state, and may not be changed by the solution of mandatory elements to the design. They must be carefully examined to ensure that they are accurate and justified. Constraints may reflect any of the following. Constraints may reflect any of the following: budget restrictions, time restrictions, technology infrastructure policies, limits on number of resources available, restrictions based on skills of the teams and stakeholders, the requirement that certain stakeholders not be affected by the implementation of the solution, compliance with regulations, and any other restriction. Organizational structure and culture. The formal and informal working relationships that exist with the enterprise may need to change to facilitate the desired outcome. Future state. How we actually interact with people actually matters in basically how we're kind of like designing the future state. Changes to reporting lines can encourage teams to work more closely together and facilitate alignment of goals and objectives. How we actually like manage these relationships might actually change the goals and objectives and how we actually move them. Elements of the organizational structure and culture may need to change to support the future state. What are the elements that we might need to change in order for the future state to be like a valid thing we're approaching? Describing the components of the future state provides insight into potential conflicts, impact, and limits. Capabilities and processes is also an element. It's like identify the kinds of activities and changes in the way activities are performed to realize the future state. New or changed capabilities and processes may be needed and deliver new products or the services to comply with the new regulations or to improve the performance of the enterprise. Technology and infrastructure. If current technology and infrastructure are insufficient to meet business needs, the business analyst identifies the changes necessary for the desired future state. The existing technology may impose technical constraints, right? Like we're looking to see if technology is actually like supporting, to see if the policies are supporting, to see if the organizational structure and culture are supporting. With any of these, we actually have to find out where we actually could interfere and if we should, if we can, and where do we actually go. And business architecture and internal assets, all of them are basically elements that we need to consider. The existing technology may impose technical constraints on the design and of the solution. These may include development languages, hardware and software platforms, application software that must be used. Technical constraints may also describe restrictions, such as a resource utilization, message size and timing, software size, maximum number of and size of files, records, and data elements. Technical constraints include an IT architecture standards that must be followed. Amazing. Policies. If current policies are insufficient to meet business needs, the business analyst identifies the changes necessary for the desired future state. Policies are a common source of constraint. They're common because like ultimately like that's the biggest thing in work culture. It's probably the biggest thing that kind of like impacts things. Business policies may mandate that solutions can be implemented given certain levels of approval, a process of obtaining approval, and the necessary criteria a proposed solution must meet in order to receive funding. In some instances, change or an existing policy may open up alternative solutions that would not otherwise be considered. The elements of any future state must effectively support one another and all contribute to the meeting of the business goals and objectives. In addition, they should be integrated into the overall desired future state of the enterprise as a whole and support that future state. Internal assets. The analysis of resources might indicate that existing resources need to be increased or require increased capabilities, or the new resources need to be developed. When analyzing resources, business analysts examine the resources needed to maintain the current state and implement the change strategy and determine what resources can be used as part of the desired future state. The assessment of the needed resources is considered when performing feasibility analysis on possible solution approaches for the change strategy. Identify assumptions. Most strategies are predicated on the set of assumptions that will determine whether or not the strategy can succeed, particularly when operating in a highly uncertain environment. Will often be difficult or impossible to prove that the delivery of a new capability will meet a business need. even if cases where it appears reasonable to assume that the new capability will have the desired effects. These assumptions, well, here, man, it's just like basically what are the things that we're not really sure of, right? Like, what are the things that we're kind of like adding in there because, like, that could be a thing or that will be a thing or something like that. Assumptions must be identified and clearly understood so that appropriate decisions can be made if the assumption later proves invalid, right? So if we make an assumption, I think it's okay. They're telling us it's okay to make an assumption, but ultimately we kind of have to see is like they have to be clearly understood as the assumptions that they are, so that the appropriate decisions can be made if the assumption later proves invalid. Change strategies in certain environments can be structured in order to test these assumptions as early as possible to support the reduction or termination of the initiative. So with change strategies, we kind of like, okay, so like assumptions kind of come with a whole lot of just kind of like reasonable pressure points, I guess. And what we end up doing is we add different kind of like, so we're assuming this, which means we have to check for this and check for this and check for this. We're also, because we're assuming this, we kind of have to like see if this doesn't work, we kind of have to create a strategy in order for it to kind of like adjust as fast as possible so that we don't waste time, don't have our resources. And also kind of like our assumptions need to be aligned in a way, because if we're assuming something, then at the very least, let the things that we're building in order for us to reach that point where the assumption is valid or not, at the very least can be usable maybe or something like this. So potential value, meeting the business objectives does not justify the transition to a future state. The potential value must be evaluated to see if it's sufficient to justify a change. Sufficient to justify a change. When defining the future state, business analysts identify the potential value of the solution. The potential value of the future state is the net benefit of the solution. After operating costs are accounted for, a change must result in greater value for the enterprise than would be achieved if no action was taken. However, it is possible that the future state will represent a decrease in value from the current state for some stakeholders or even for the enterprise as a whole. So here they're telling us a change must result in greater value, but there is a possibility that the future state might actually bring less value. New regulations or increased competition, for example, might need to be addressed for the enterprise to remain operating, but still could decrease the overall value captured. So you're giving us an example where a change is necessary, but it doesn't really like add value, but at the very least it guarantees our sustainability or like our existence. That's also a possibility. While determining the future dreaming, while determining the future state, business analysts consider increased or decreased potential value from external opportunities revealed in assessing external influences. Because ultimately, like if you while doing your research, if you find an external opportunity and like what makes you so sure stakeholders are not going to think that is more valuable than this one, and it can create a state of like decreased potential value probably or increased because we chased that opportunity. Unknown strengths of new partners because ultimately like we kind of like realize how weak we are in comparison. New technologies or knowledge. Once you find new technologies, you kind of see how much like what you're doing maybe is not really like aligned in a way that's efficient and effective. Potential loss of a competitor in the market could be positive or could tell us a lot about how we might fail. Mandated adoption of a change component. Mandated adoption of a change component is basically is something that probably stakeholders insist upon. Like that might actually lead to a low value. So business analysts identify the specific opportunities for potential alterations in value, as well as the probability of those increases in the individual components of the proposed change. So here they're saying we identify specific opportunities for potential alterations in value, as well as the probability of those increases for the individual components of the proposed change. Because ultimately everything could actually change and will eventually affect us. Business analysts estimate a total potential value by aggregating across all opportunities. Remember, when we're measuring value, there's qualitative, unqualitative, sales-wise, financial, what do they call it? opportunity costs, and all that stuff. The potential value, including the details of the expected benefit and costs, and the likely result of if no change is made. That's also something that we have to. It's a selling point, right? Because it's the same as if you don't buy this car, you're gonna keep taking the bus for another 6 months. Like, yeah, I'm no longer selling the car. I'm kind of like making sure they understand that if you actually like that you if you keep taking the bus, how miserable you're gonna be. Relating descriptions of potential value to measure of actual value currently being achieved enables stakeholders to understand the expected change in value. In most cases, the future state will not address all of the opportunities for improvement. Any unaddressed opportunities might remain valid after a solution is implemented and should be noted for future analysis and other changes. Okay, so just document all the unaddressed opportunities because they might actually be valid. And we really have to kind of like engage with the stakeholders in a way so that they understand the expected change in value. And in most cases, the future state will not address all the opportunities. Because a lot of people might be like, this is going to save us versus this is going to allow us to actually build on something better, right? In addition to the potential value of the future state, this analysis should consider the acceptable level of investment to reach the future state, while the actual investment will depend on the change strategy. This information, okay, so like here, potential value of the future state. Analysis could consider acceptable level of investment to reach the future state, while the actual investment will depend on the change strategy. This information guides the selection of possible strategies. So ultimately, what you're investing is not really in the future state, but in the change strategy to reach it. That must be very clear, because like sometimes, and I've had this issue once before. The people that gave me money wanted to see results, and they didn't understand that the results were basically one result was the culmination of 3 months of work. So at month number 2, I was not able to communicate properly, and they were like, "We don't want to do this anymore." It's a shame because I kept showing them everything that could happen if we continued, but they couldn't see it because they wanted direct returns. So stakeholders are really like one of the most important things that you engage with. Current state description provides the context within which the work needs to be completed. It is often used as a starting point for the guidelines and tools, current state description, metrics and key performance indicators, KPIs. That's what we use to actually measure our progress, right? An organizational strategy is basically the path, method, and approach to enterprises. Amazing. What are the techniques? Acceptance and evaluation criteria. All right, so used to make what I'm gonna start assuming that you guys know these details, the ones that are in between. Because acceptance and evaluation criteria is we're evaluating what we have and we're seeing does this work, does this not work. A balanced scorecard set targets for measuring the future state. Benchmark is a balanced scorecard is basically where we are now and where we were when we started. Benchmarking, the market analysis used to make decisions about future state objectives. We kind of like, yeah, so we kind of like we use data in order for us to see how we're charting things. Brainstorming, business capability analysis to see what we're capable of doing. Business cases, that's from research and like things that basically were done before and things that we can do. The business model canvas, which is basically how the project actually makes sense, used to plan strategy and enterprise by mapping out the needed infrastructure, target customer base, financial cost structure, the revenue streams required to fill the value proposition to customers in the desired future state. Decision analysis used to compare the different future state options and understand which is the best choice. Decision modeling, financial analysis, functional decomposition, which is used to break down complex systems within the future state for better understanding. Interviews, lessons learned, metrics and key performance indicators, mind mapping, organizational modeling. Organizational modeling is basically business modeling, but modeling how the operations work and the roles basically in it. No, process modeling is how the organization works. Organizational of how the process of how the process works starts from like the product starts with like research, I guess, and then moves into like prototyping and all that shit. Organizational modeling is the people involved, responsibilities and structures, reporting structures. Prototyping, scope modeling, surveyor questionnaires, SWOT analysis, vendor assessment, and workshops. Who are the stakeholders? The customers, the domain subject matter experts, an end user, Implementation subject matter experts get it because there's a subject matter expert about the domain and the implementation. Implementation is best because like some things are tricky to actually to implement, but easier to research. Operational support, the people that are involved in operations or that will help you actually like implement this, the project manager, the regulator, and the sponsor, supplier, and finally the tester. We love the tester. What are the outputs, business objectives, the desired decision that the business wishes to pursue in order to achieve the future state, desired direction? Future state description, this is the future state describing the future state, and potential value. What's the potential value to be gained? Chapter's done. Second chapter is assessing risks.